Here's the track I'll be taking you through today. You may have noticed that many of these channels are in audio, which is atypical for this channel. The reason behind this is that I started this track in Bitwig while I was cheating on Ableton for a few days. However, I did ultimately remain resolute in my commitment and transferred the track back into Ableton to finish. The drums for this project, along with many more, are available in my sub-focus sample library, available on Samples by Vanity, linked below. This project, including the samples, is accessible to all my Audio Alchemist and Sonic Sculptor patrons. Drums. I made both the kick and snare from scratch, which I have a complete tutorial on that deconstructs my entire drum synthesis process. You can find the tutorial linked below and popping up on screen somewhere now. This is important to note as I haven't applied any processing to these sounds in the project, except for some gluing on the group bus to help them gel with the percussion. In the genre of drum and bass, it's typical for producers to craft their drums because they play such a vital role. Take a listen to how they sound in this project. The only modification I have made to these samples is shortening them to approximately a quarter note duration. This helps maintain their tightness and allows other elements to fill in the gaps. Personally, I don't use these shortened samples as my sidechain triggers, a process I will demonstrate later. However, if you choose to do so, you may want to shorten them even further, perhaps to an eighth note, to avoid an overly drastic pumping effect. On the opposite end of the waveform spectrum, it's important to ensure that your drums don't have any silence at the beginning. Trim them right down to the transient using a small fade to prevent any clicking caused by zero crossing issues. The percussion is where this groove begins to get interesting. Here's how it sounds all together. I'll go through this group by collections of sounds, starting with the shakers. Here's a shuffle percussion, which I chopped out of a noisier loop and rearranged. A live hat recording, which I chopped to remove the kick and snare spill, as this is a stem from a recording of a full drum kit. The genre of drum and bass demands precision. While I do enjoy the technical challenge it brings, I often find myself wanting to incorporate acoustic sounds to infuse a human touch. If I zoom in, you'll notice that the hats are slightly off, just like a real human drummer. This introduces a hint of imperfection and imparts a more organic feel to the drums. To emphasize this concept even further, I incorporated a layered drum roll from a live recording of a drum kit. This roll leads us between the two 8-bar sections. In these transitional sections, the rest of the percussion stops to add variation and highlight the rolls. Additionally, I have removed everything for a quarter note here to create interest in the second 8-bar pattern. The percussion group sits within the overall drum group. I start with an EQ to remove frequencies below 25 Hz from the stereo information. Additionally, I'm cutting frequencies below 320 Hz from the sides, which eliminates the stereo information from the fundamentals of my kick and snare, effectively placing them in mono to make them hit harder. This is then followed by another cut around 500 Hz, eliminating some muddiness in the mid-range of the sound. Here's a comparison of the sound before and after these adjustments. Let's move on to saturation, which injects harmonic and inharmonic overtones and brings in that warm analog feel. I'm also boosting these two middle bands, which, to my ears, increases the presence or slap of the kick and snare. Here's a before and after. I'm aiming for a tight drum groove with the sharp kick and snare that stand out above the level of the percussion. The drum groove doesn't have to sound cohesive because the kick and snare need to be that much louder to cut through the mix when the other instruments are added. And the percussion doesn't need to be as loud as the kick and the snare to cut through the mix because of the equal loudness curve and our sensitivity to higher frequencies. Bass. Here's how it sounds. I was aiming for that blown out speaker sound as I wanted something that could support the energetic lead line. The bass is divided into sub and mid. The sub is kept straightforward, consisting of a single sine wave from Serum without any additional elements. I adjusted the release so that when a note ends, it smoothly transitions or drops into the next one. These gaps in the MIDI are to prevent the bass from overwhelming the mix, allowing the track to have some space to breathe. Take a listen to the sub. An EQ is then cutting off everything above 100 Hz, as the mid-bass will serve this role. The compressor is applying automatic sidechain compression to the sub, and this utility is also being used for manual sidechain compression, which we'll discuss later. MSED is ensuring that the audio is in mono and that no stereo information has sneaked in during the processing. The mid-bass is a preset from Cymatics that originally sounded like this. Then, after the processing, the EQ does the opposite of the sub by removing all frequencies below 100 Hz. Subsequently, we have a saturator and then the plugins for the sidechaining. However, it's in the group processing where things start to get more interesting. Without the group processing, here's how everything sounds. Then with. Let's start off with another saturator, because, well, why not? Next up, I'm dividing my bass into two separate signals for parallel processing. The first signal is the clean sub, left untouched without any effects. The second signal consists of everything above 100 Hz, specifically the mid-bass, which is processed with distortion plugins. The goal here is to maintain the cleanness of the sub-bass for maximum impact, while applying the distortion solely to the mid-range bass. Here's a before and after of the distortion. It's always fun to experiment with the order of your distortion plugins too. In this particular case, I found placing the OTT before the trash worked better, but it could have easily been the other way around. To ensure a mono sound in the lower range, the EQ cuts out everything below 100 Hz from the sides of my signal. My reasoning for using an EQ to cut the sides rather than, say, a mono maker is because some mono maker plugins collapse the sides into the middle, resulting in phase issues. And EQ is just a surefire way to avoid such problems. This reduction in the high frequencies helps to eliminate any harshness that might clash with the main lead. There's also a significant cut here at 500 Hz to remove a section of muddy frequencies. The compressor's role here is to maintain a consistent volume for the bass throughout its note changes. The attack and release settings are set to fast to catch and quickly release any peaks, as we don't need them on the bass. The look ahead feature is turned on so that the compressor can anticipate upcoming peaks and respond in time. I consider these plugins to be my control group. After distorting the sound, I need to make it usable again and ensure it blends in well with the other instruments. The last tweak I added was an auto filter that opens up a low pass filter towards the end of each note. The saturator follows the same automation pattern but increasing the gain, making the opening of the filter slightly more pronounced. This imparts a sense of motion to the bass, preventing it from sounding like a stagnant cluster of continuously playing notes. Music. This track is being driven by this main lead line. In Subfocus's music, there is usually a melodic lead as the focal point, often accompanied by vocals. One of the reasons why this genre is so popular is because of the infectious melodic hook that gets stuck in your head and leaves you humming along. Because of the need for melody, the inception of this lead was a chord progression. I chose the C major scale to keep things simple and came up with these 5 chords. I then added some passing notes to make them sound less blocky. Then played around with inversions. You might think that the last version sounds worse, and you would be right, especially when played on a Worthy or a piano plugin. However, I knew that I was writing for synths and wanted the chords to be positioned closer together to minimize the variation and leaps between them. The sound itself is a bass preset I found in a pack. The ARP is set to blossom up, and I've got an LFO on the gate, or note length, moving at a rate you can see here. The octaves for the ARP to play across are set to 1, so it doesn't sound like a typical ARP jumping around all over the place. The rest of these settings were included in the preset, and no changes were made. Occasionally, you stumble across a sound and you just know it's perfect. In fact, the reason this is called Lead OG is because I attempted other variations, but this one just sounded best. That was then exported out of Bitwig and into Ableton, where the processing chain grew. Firstly, I applied an EQ to remove the low frequencies, then more compression with approximately 6 decibels of reduction. Finally, a Soothe 2, which functions like a multi-band EQ and helps to even out the peaks in the sound. This particular sound has many peaks, so it needed extensive processing to bring it under control and maintain a consistent level. Here's a comparison of the sound before and after the effects. These compressors are for the sidechaining, which I'll explain in the next chapter. Within this sound, there's a counter melody happening within the bass region. I took this lead and tried to isolate it as best as I could. The final sound comes in within the second 16-bar phrase and acts as the answer to the main lead's question. It's the same sound as the main lead, but it's playing octaves on the root notes of the chords. All of these sounds are then grouped together in the music bus and undergo additional processing in Ableton. You've already seen these 3 plugins multiple times, so I won't go into detail about them. Now, allow me to explain the purpose of these 2 compressors for my sidechaining and some post-processing surprises I had. Sidechaining and post-processing. I'm not following the usual practice of sidechaining to the kick and snare. Instead, I'm using chopped pieces of white noise arranged in the kick and snare pattern to trigger the sidechain. It's important to note that the purpose of the white noise is not to be audible, but rather to serve as a trigger for the compressors. My reasoning for this is that I don't want everything to duck for the entirety that the kick and snare are playing, as that creates a pumping effect that I'm not after in drum and bass. Instead, the white noise is only as long as the transient of the drums, meaning the sidechaining effect is almost undetectable to the ear. The white noise sample comes in slightly early too, which ensures the compressor has fully reduced the sounds before the kick and snare hit. The compressor's sidechain is set to the maximum, resulting in approximately -70 decibels of reduction in Ableton. But because -70 decibels is not complete silence, I manually added a sidechain with a utility plugin to lower the volume of the channels during the white noise bursts. However, when I muted the drums and exported the track, I realized that this wasn't sufficient because there was still some residue sound playing instead of silence where the kick and the snare were hitting. There was a strange click sound playing over the kick and another sound in place of the snare. And as I scrubbed through the track, I also noticed that the sidechain wasn't working in a few instances, which was surprising considering the extent I had gone to in this project. So I did what any rational person would do. I exported the entire project pre-master, excluding the kick, snare and sub-bass. Then I brought this back into Ableton and manually added in the silences for both the kick and the snare drum. Thereafter, I also imported the main kick and snare and sub-bass as audio files, again pre-master. This is a slightly lengthier process than bouncing in place, but the same principle applies. Listening back, I also noticed that because of how fast the automatic sidechain is, we've got all of this clicking noise on the sub. So I added in fades to remove these clicks, which also took care of the sidechaining. I also opted to use an EQ to filter array the top end to clean up the sub. Much cleaner. I then mastered these 3 channels and compared it with the version bounced straight out of Ableton with the same mastering chain, but without all of these audio edits I've just made. The edited version has so much more bass, it almost disappears on the other. It's also about 1.5 decibels louder, which is again surprising, but perhaps is due to removing the clicks on the sub bass and some of the other audio information that was overlapping the kick and snare. The correlation meter is also showing much less movement, which means there are fewer issues with phasing in this edited version. I'll now play the entire track with and without the sidechain so you can hear the difference. Effects. The effects in this project consist of 3 elements, 2 risers and an effects bleep sound, as I've named it. The initial white noise riser was created using Serum, while the second one is a reversed chop of the main lead. The FX bleep also originated from the same source. Although this arrangement is only 16 bars long, in a complete track, it would be beneficial to experiment with effects, as they add a lot of intrigue to this style of music, especially when transitioning between different sections of a song. I won't dwell on these effects, as they are all relatively simple. The reverb is applied as a send effect, and everything in this project is being sent there except for the sub bass and kick drum. I have also used an EQ to eliminate any frequencies below 215 Hz. The second cut at 500 Hz is removing everything below that from the side information of the track. I've also applied the same sidechaining technique I've spoken about at length. Mastering. According to his computer music interview, Subfocus uses T-Racks for his mastering. Since I don't have T-Racks, I relied on my instincts to determine what adjustments this track required. I examined Subfocus's tracks using Span and noticed that they primarily consist of a dense range of frequencies. As a result, I aimed to enhance the thickness of my mix and achieve a better balance between the low and high frequency regions. To achieve this, we start with a tape emulator plugin. This plugin smooths out the mix, especially the highs, which are rounded off around 15 kHz. Much of the intensity and harshness in the top end has now gone, and the mix feels less wild. Following that is an opto compressor that has a slow response time on the peaks, meaning that, like the tape emulation, it's great as a smoothing tool. That's the smoothing stage of the master done. Next is the surgical tools. A linear phase EQ removes the low frequencies below 25 Hz from the stereo information because we can't hear them, and they would otherwise clutter up the available headroom. For the same reasons, I'm removing everything below 150 Hz from the side channels, effectively placing everything under this in mono. The rest of the adjustments are a matter of personal preference, but I often find that boosting the frequencies around 8 kHz on the side channels enhances the high end rather nicely. Here's a before and after. Next is Gullfoss, a second EQ, which I'm still learning. Recover and Tame are the main controls of Gullfoss that help enhance the clarity of audio by uncovering masked signal components. Recover focuses on treating the components that are dominated, while Tame worked on the components that are too dominant. When using Gullfoss, my standard approach is to find the perfect balance between these two controls. Next, I threw in the Ozone low-end focus module, but didn't notice much of a difference A/Bing it. The MSED plugin is turning down the side channels by 2 decibels, and then turning up the mid or mono signal by 2 decibels. This doesn't always work, and can often wreak havoc on the stereo information of a track. However, in this case, it tightened everything up to my ears, and reduced some of the movement on the correlation meter. That's the surgical processing done, onto the leveling. I have a serial limiter set up here, which is a trick I learned from Icicle and Noisia. The Pro L with no look ahead is the responsive limiter, but because of the look ahead being set to 0, it's slightly late, allowing the transients to pass through. Oversampling is enabled to prevent or reduce aliasing by increasing the sample rate or number of samples taken per second. This option helps maintain the fidelity and clarity of the sound, especially if it contains significant frequency content near or beyond the Nyquist limit. The second limiter, Ozone's maximizer, analyzes the controlled signal, resulting in a different response compared to the Pro L. It's less nervous and better able to smooth out the controlled signal. By combining Pro L to address the transients and then using the maximizer as a subtle limiter over the top, you can better achieve a cohesive sound that brings the entire track together. Let's now compare this setup of serial limiters with a single Pro L that's leveling the track to the same average loudness. You can hear a significant improvement in the overall clarity and definition when using this serial limiter setup. Everything sounds controlled, cohesive, and punchy. In contrast, the single limiter sounds like everything is breaking up, like it's tittering on the edge of distortion while crushing the transients of the kick and snare. It's worth mentioning too that the serial limiter setup is only reaching around -5 decibels of gain reduction combined, whereas the single Pro L is hitting around -11 decibels, over twice as much to achieve the same average loudness. Subfocus's track's average loudness sits somewhere between 6 to 7 decibels, which we're hitting here, and this track could even be squeezed more if needed. Here's a before and after of the complete mastering chain. I have applied a single limiter to level up the track to a similar volume, allowing us to compare the mastering chain without being fooled by the volume increase. I hope that this deconstruction gave you some ideas on how to approach music in the style of sub-focus, or more broadly, dance floor drum and bass. This was just one approach of many, and I always encourage experimentation to discover the workflow that resonates with your creative instincts. Thank you for your viewership, attention, and support. Until next time.